Well, I was 17 when 1967 started, and it was indeed a strange and memorable year. I was a senior in high school, set to graduate in June of that year. The high school I graduated from was Cass Tech High School in downtown Detroit. It took students from all over the city, so there wasn't a lot of after-school social activity with your classmates. Had a few classmates close by, but not a lot. So high school wasn't particularly fun for me. Any of the 3 years I was there. The beginning of that year, I was driving a 1959 Ford. It was a four-door, black, nothing exciting about this car. It did, however, have rolled headrests that I put on. This was before headrests became mandatory in cars, so it was kind of fashionable to have these round rolled headrests. And, and they came with a bar attached to the back of it. You screwed it right to the back of the seat. The seats back there, the frames of them were wood, so you could screw right into the frame of the interior frame of the seat. So I had headrests on the front seat of my car. I also had one of those really cool skulls on the back deck that had the red eyes that blinked with the turn signals. That was pretty cool. Had that going. And I also had a 45 RPM record player under the dash up front. I'll see if I can find a picture of that somewhere. But it was kind of cool because you put the records in upside down, and it had a spindle. It was actually a record changer, and it had a spindle, and you'd take a stack of records. I don't remember how many it held, 5 or 6 probably, and you'd push them up on the spindle, and after they'd play, they'd drop down, and the next one would play. It was pretty cool. Way ahead of its time. Way ahead of the MP3 players and CDs and cassettes and 8-tracks and all that. This was before 8-tracks even. I had turned 18 in May of 1967, but at the time 18 was not a big deal because the age of consent or the age of adulthood, however you want to put it, was still 21 at that time. You couldn't drink, couldn't vote, couldn't do anything till you were 21 at that time. Didn't drop down to 18 until sometime later. I don't remember exactly when. So turning 18 was not a huge deal, other than the fact that you were eligible for the draft after high school. After high school and before college, I got a job with Ford Motor Company at their Dearborn foundry. And this was a filthy job, I'll tell you. The air in the foundry was so thick that you could light a lighter and you could see the particles in the air sparkling just from your lighter going. That's how thick it was in the air. This was before a lot of the safety things were put in place. The main thing that we dealt with at the foundry was raw engine blocks and cylinder heads. They would come out of the castings and they would be full of sand and whatnot, and they would come down the line and we'd have to take a poker and clean out the water cooling jackets and these things and then move them around to the next conveyor belt. It was an absolutely filthy job. And my foreman, I don't remember his name, I was just there for a couple months, and he was a tobacco chewer. This is kind of disgusting, so excuse me ahead of time. He was a tobacco chewer, and the foundry was so noisy that if he had something to say to you, he'd have to get right up close to your ear and talk to you. And like I said, he was the tobacco chewer, and you kind of get the drift without me being too explicit. It was pretty disgusting, but it fit in with the atmosphere of the foundry. There was one guy there, one full-time guy. I was just a summer help, but there was one full-time guy there. In the locker room, he kept his work clothes, and he had this sleeveless work shirt that he wore, and I don't think it had ever been washed. He would come into the locker room, change out of his street clothes into his work clothes, and this thing was absolutely filthy. And then after work, he would take it off and turn back into his street clothes to go home. So it was an experience for me working at the foundry, and it taught me what I did not want to do for the rest of my life. Of course, there were people clamoring for those jobs. A steady job with Ford Motor Company in Detroit in the 60s. That was a good job to have. I think at the time I was making either $3.25 or $3.50 an hour. But I was living large at that. For a summer job, I was happy to have a summer job paying that much. Towards the end of July was a pretty rough time for Detroit. That was when the riots started, towards the end of July, and that was a pretty traumatic time for a lot of people. My dad was a Detroit policeman, so it was kind of tough watching him dress up in his riot gear to go to work. I remember they issued him a riot helmet, and it was white, and he was on the night shift. So it was kind of ironic. He said something about to the effect of like wearing a target on your back. So what he did was he painted his riot helmet black. I don't know how he got away with that within the police force, but he did it anyway. So I also remember during that time that he bought a M1 carbine through a magazine ad. It was probably an NRA magazine, and he bought this M1 carbine, and I'm pretty sure it was $20. And he carried that during the riots. Never had to use it, fortunately, but he did carry that. And I still have that now. Later in the year, after quitting my job at Ford Motor Company and making those high wages, I bought myself my first new car. I bought a 1967 Volkswagen Beetle. It was dark blue, no frills, just a basic Beetle. And I believe I paid $1,900 for it, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, that was my going to college vehicle. I went to a local college, Lawrence Institute of Technology, just outside of Detroit. The high school I went to was like I said, technical high school, and I took architectural classes there. I had it in my mind that I wanted to be an architect. I don't know where that came from, but at the time, that's what it was. And Lawrence Institute of Technology had a good architectural course or classes or reputation, however you want to say it. So I enrolled there, and my counselor, in all, I was going to say wisdom, but that would be a tongue-in-cheek word, wisdom, set me up in my first year of college with algebra, trigonometry, and physics, 3 classes. I was not prepared for that. I did okay in math, but I was not prepared for those 3 classes. And as it turned out, I was not doing well in any of the 3 classes, so I decided that college was not for me. I knew that shortly after starting. Probably regardless of the classes, college was not for me. So I dropped out of college. And having dropped out of college and being 18 and Vietnam going in full force, I would have been classified 1A in very short order. At the time, there were close to 500,000 troops, American troops in Vietnam, and it was a tough time for a lot of people. My best friend, Tim Johnson, had dropped out of high school and joined the Marines, and he was already in Vietnam at that time. Another friend of mine from grade school who I had kept in touch with and was good friends with through high school, Dale Tuchel, he had signed up for the Navy, and he was going to be going first part of the year. So all things being equal, and my family had kind of a Navy tradition anyway. My dad was in the Navy, and I had a couple uncles in the Navy. So I decided to join the Navy as well. And I did that. I signed up to join the Navy late in 1967, and I ended up going in middle of January the following year. And of course, we can't forget during 1967 all the outstanding music that came out in that year and that was on the charts. 1967 was the year that the Beatles put out the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album. So that was pretty memorable. There was just a ton of good music on the charts in '67. The Doors had Light My Fire. Ruby Tuesday was on the charts by the Rolling Stones. There's a pretty memorable tune right there. How about White Rabbit by the Jefferson Airplane? This was before they were Jefferson Starship even. And also, Whiter Shade of Pale, Procol Harum. I'm sure you remember that one if you were listening to music at that time. Just a ton of good music. And that doesn't even touch the soul music that was out there that meant so much to me coming from Detroit, Motown, you know. We had Aretha Franklin with Respect. That one's been around. That one's still around from time to time. You still hear that one. How about Ain't No Mountain High Enough with Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell? Remember that one? Plus, you know, you can't forget the Supremes and the Four Tops, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Like I said, just a ton of good music at that time. I'll put a couple of links down in the description of this video to a couple of my favorite songs during that year. You'll YouTube videos of my favorite songs from '67. So enjoy that if you're inclined. There were a few other things, notable things that happened in 1967 that weren't personal to me, but notable in history, in the history books. That was the year of the Six-Day Arab-Israeli War. It was also the year of the first human heart transplant. First ATM was made public. And how about the first Super Bowl? Super Bowl #1. Green Bay Packers and Kansas City Chiefs. At the time, it wasn't called the Super Bowl. It was called something else. I can't think what it was at the moment. But it was later, when they decided to make it an annual thing, they decided to call the first one Super Bowl I. But like I said, when it was played, it was not called the Super Bowl I. Little tidbit for you there. Now I know I'm leaving out a whole bunch of stuff from the year 1967. You couldn't possibly put everything that happened in a year into a 5 or 10 minute YouTube video. But I touched on the highlights that were significant to me and a couple of things that were historical. So we'll leave it at that. Maybe we'll revisit it at another time. And there'll probably be some overlap with some other vids I do. So if you've got recollections of 1967, I'd love to hear them. You know, put them down in the comments. If there was something happened in that year or some event in your life that took place in 1967, drop it in the comments. I'd like to hear what was going on with other people. So feel free to do that. Peace and joy.